Welcome to our Wednesday Bible study. Glad you're tuning in. You might want to be opening your Bibles to Matthew 17 if you're accustomed to looking at the scripture with us and not just hearing it. We are glad to have you tuning in, and we want to invite you to our in-person Wednesday Bible study. I know every week I sound like a broken record, always wanting to invite you to be with us in person. There's nothing like and nothing that can take the place of actual in-person fellowship with people of like precious faith, with those of the household of faith, with those of the family of God. And we would love to have you come and be with us and be an honored guest. If you would, every Wednesday night, 7 o'clock. On the Lord's Day, every Sunday morning, 10 a.m., and then 11 a.m. for a period of worship, and then every Sunday evening at 6 p.m. for an evening worship. And now, might mention on the last Sunday of each month, we do meet at 2 p.m. for an evening worship. But every other Sunday evening is going to be at 6 p.m. And we would love to have you come and be with us on those occasions. Now, as we get into our study, looking at Matthew chapter 17, remember that we have already looked at a couple of other portions of the chapter. We looked at the matter regarding the Mount of Transfiguration, where Jesus was transfigured in the presence of Peter, James, and John. He took those three disciples up the mountain with him, and there he was transformed, or he changed forms, and they witnessed or saw him in his glorified state as he spoke with Moses and Elijah about his upcoming death, and how, of course, we broke that down and understood some very great truths that it presented and some application even to our life as we looked at that portion. Then last week in our Wednesday Bible study, we looked at the section of Scripture where Jesus healed a man, or healed his son rather, a man's son that was possessed of an unclean spirit. And it was a case where his disciples, 9 of them, the 9 apostles that did not ascend the Mount of Transfiguration, were unable to cast out that devil or that unclean spirit. And so they did request to know why they couldn't, and Jesus indicated that their faith was not as strong as it should have been. It needed to be increased. And so we made some application from that as well regarding even our own faith. This week, as we advance in our discussion, we come to verse number 22 and 23, a set of verses that is going to emphasize the betrayal, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus. And then we'll look at a second segment, verse 24 through 27, that round out the chapter and deal with the subject matter of taxes, particular tax that was imposed upon the people of Judea, upon the Israelite family. And so we'll look at that passage as well today. And as always, we're seeking to make not only an understanding of what Matthew is presenting, but how it applies even to you and I. There's always the matter of what it said, what was Matthew trying to communicate, how it is to be interpreted, and then how is it to be applied? And so we'll do that today as well. As we pick up with verse 22 and 23, remember that Matthew's purpose is to focus on Jesus as the Messiah. And so all along through the book of Matthew, whatever his purpose is, it relates to that understanding. Jesus is the Messiah. And of course, as we look to his betrayal, his death, and his resurrection, number one, those are matters of prophecy. There were things in the Old Testament relative to Jesus dying. There were also things relative to him being betrayed, even to a specific amount for which he would be betrayed, in the 30 pieces of silver. And then, of course, his resurrection was foretold in the Old Testament. A passage like Daniel chapter 7, when the Son of Man went unto or ascended to the Ancient of Days. That was, at that point, a kingdom would be given. And so Daniel prophesied of the ascension of Jesus, which would speak to his resurrection. And obviously, David, as Peter quoted him in Acts chapter 2, focused on the resurrection of the Messiah, the resurrection of Jesus. And so these prophecies are going to be fulfilled in Jesus, indicating he is the Messiah. He is the one they were looking for. Now, one of the problems that creeps in is he didn't meet the expectation that the people of Israel had. And we might discuss, ad nauseum, why they had those particular understandings. That really doesn't matter right now, just to know that they had a misunderstanding of the very nature of the Messiah and his kingdom. And so even now at this point, when the disciples are told what is going to happen, they're going to be of sorrowful heart. And so verse 22 and 23 relate to the death and the resurrection of Jesus. The second portion that we want to look at in verse 24 through 27 is going to deal with a question of taxation. Jesus is going to be approached through Peter regarding a taxable payment being made, or a payment of tax being made. And so we'll see what Jesus said. And as always, how does that fit into Matthew's purpose, and what application does it have for us? Let's begin with these first two verses. Verse 22 says, "And while they abode in Galilee, Jesus said unto them, The Son of Man shall be betrayed into the hands of men, and they shall kill him, and the third day he shall be raised again. And they were exceeding sorry." Two verses, very simple, but yet with great depth in meaning. So notice first, they abode in Galilee. Now remember, early in the chapter, they had been in Caesarea Philippi. They had been in the northeastern portion of Palestine. Caesarea Philippi was actually in the tetrarchy of Philip. And to its south and west was Galilee, and then Samaria, and then Judah, as you go from north to south. So looking at the land of Palestine in the first century, in the days of Jesus, you had four main areas. Now across the River Jordan, you did have the region of Perea. In John chapter 7, I believe it is, Jesus would actually go into Perea for a while. There was what we might refer to as the Perean ministry, a time period when he went and he did preach in that area. But a great deal of the time that Jesus worked in his earthly ministry, it was spent in Galilee. And so in chapter 17, you have progressed from Caesarea Philippi, and you have trekked back down into Galilee. Now, Mark chapter 9 and verse 30 says, they departed thence. That is, they departed Caesarea Philippi, or that region where Caesarea Philippi was located, and they passed through Galilee. Passed through Galilee in Mark chapter 9 simply means that they were working their way through Galilee. As Jesus' earthly ministry often did, it was one that was on the move. He was constantly going different places and preaching, a circuit, if you will. And so as they are making that circuit, they're passing from Caesarea Philippi back into Galilee, where in verse 24 they will make it all the way back to Capernaum. Jesus is speaking with his disciples. He didn't want anyone to know that they had moved back into the area of Galilee, or that they had gotten back into that region. And no doubt, as Mark says, for he taught his disciples. He was wanting that one-on-one time with his disciples, or that very personal time in which he was able to instruct his disciples specifically. He's trying to prepare them for what is coming, because it is only a few months away now. Remember, we've already advanced into the last 6 months of the earthly ministry of Jesus, leading up to his betrayal, his arrest, his trials, and his crucifixion. And so we're in the waning days, we might say weeks, of the earthly ministry of Jesus. So he is trying to rapidly prepare his disciples for what is coming. And the culmination of this work of Jesus is going to focus right here in the words that he says. The Son of Man shall be betrayed into the hands of men. Mark puts it this way: the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of men. Now, once he is betrayed into the hands of men, or he is delivered to the hands of men, the men are going to then kill him. They're going to put him to death. And then the third day, that is after the death, the third day he will be raised again. Jesus actually reveals three aspects of his earthly ministry here. He is going to reveal or explain, number one, the present state. He is, number two, going to explain to whom he was delivered in that present state and what would result from that. And then number three, he's going to explain the future state by telling of his resurrection. So I want us to think about this for just a few minutes as part of our understanding and our application. Now remember, in Jesus saying these words, he is also presenting himself as the fulfillment of prophecy. Later on, they're going to understand this. But as we're talking about it right now, recognize that when we deal with the betrayal of Jesus, that was something the Old Testament foretold. Even right down to the very point that it would be for 30 pieces of silver. We also recognize that his death was presented in the Old Testament. The idea that he would be led as a lamb to the slaughter in Isaiah 53, and several other passages that would relate the idea that he was going to die. Even the initial prophecy, Genesis 3 and verse 15, talked about how the heel of the seed of woman would be bruised. There was some kind of wound that was going to be inflicted. Ultimately, not a fatal blow or a fatal wound. You might say, well, he was put to death. Yes, but ultimately not fatal, because he would rise from the dead. So the grave wouldn't hold him. So you look at the prophecies of the Old Testament, and they presented the fact that the Messiah was going to suffer and die after being betrayed. But those prophecies also spoke of his resurrection in a couple of different ways. There is the typology of Abraham and Isaac, when Isaac was called upon to offer his son, his only son Isaac, as a sacrifice. And of course, there is the correlation between Abraham's offering of Isaac, his son, and God offering his only begotten son in sacrifice. And sacrifice would involve death. And you might say, well, Abraham didn't bring about Isaac's death. Well, when you understand the intent of Abraham, the only reason Isaac didn't die on that altar is because God stayed his hand. For all intent and purposes, Isaac was as good as offered. And so with the staying of his hand, Isaac was then released from the altar and thus sacrificed. And you might recall that in the book of Hebrews, it is stated of Abraham that he did the math, or he figured, he accounted that God would raise him from the dead. That if he was going to have to put him to death, then he knew that God would also raise him from the dead, because Isaac was the one through whom the seed promise was going to be fulfilled. And so Isaac, having no progeny as yet, God would have to raise him up in order to fulfill the seed promise if Abraham put him to death on the altar. And so we recognize, even in the person of Isaac, through Abraham's sacrificing of him, or willingness to sacrifice him, that the resurrection was actually prophesied, or was seen via the typology of the Old and New Testament. We also know, though, that in Daniel chapter 7, in the night visions, Daniel saw one like the Son of Man going to the Ancient of Days. In verse 13 and 14, and when that 1, as the Son of Man went to the Ancient of Days, he received glory and dominion and a kingdom. And so going to the Ancient of Days speaks of the ascension of Jesus. And if Jesus was prophesied to die, there would also be the resurrection to precipitate the ascension back to heaven. So the Old Testament foresaw, spoke of, prophesied of the very things Jesus spoke of. Of course, his disciples didn't understand it. In fact, in Mark chapter 9 and verse 32, right after he talks about the Son of Man being betrayed or delivered into the hands of men, the Bible says they, that is the apostles, understood not that saying and were afraid to ask. Maybe because of the nature of the subject, coupled with their own sorrow. Maybe it's because the last time they said anything in response, remember Peter rebuked the Lord for talking that way, and the Lord said, "Get behind me, Satan." And so maybe that's why they feared to say anything, but they didn't understand what Jesus was talking about. Now, I want us to clearly see now and understand from the point of looking back now and understanding the full picture from God's Word, what exactly we are talking about here. So in Matthew 17, as we look at this matter, let's think about what Jesus is saying here. Number one, as he's preparing his disciples, he explained his present state. And in this present state, he says the Son of Man is betrayed. Now, remember, we're weeks away from Jesus actually being betrayed. And Judas hasn't even as yet made the deal in conspiring with the Jewish leadership to betray Jesus, to lead them to him so that they might arrest him in a place out of the purview of the people. They obviously didn't want to take Jesus in the midst of the people because there was a concern how the people would respond. And so they work with Judas, who has agreed to sell Jesus. When you get over toward Matthew 27, you'll see where Judas goes and then leads out that band of soldiers to the garden where Jesus was, after eating that Passover meal with his disciples. And so he is speaking of it as though it is already happening or has already happened. So the Son of Man is delivered or is betrayed. Now, we might ask this question: who delivered Jesus? And this is an interesting consideration when you really think about it. Obviously, from Matthew's point of view, he was betrayed. So you might say, well, he was delivered by a traitorous disciple. Yes, he was. And obviously, in Matthew 26 and verse 24, we have record of Judas making that agreement. And then in chapter 26, he actually betrays him. And in chapter 27, the regret that he has. So, yes, he was delivered by a traitorous disciple. You also notice, though, that he was delivered by the Father. You say, what do you mean by that? Is delivered into the hands of men, or is betrayed into the hands of men? Well, he was betrayed in the sense of what Judas did. But he was delivered in the sense that God delivered him. Remember what Acts chapter 2 said regarding the words of Peter in the fulfillment of all things that happened. After he had revealed to the multitude that the things that were transpiring was the fulfillment of the prophet Joel. Acts 2:16, this is that which was spoken by the prophet Joel. And he quotes Joel 2:28 through 30 and says, this is God's outpouring of the Spirit. And then he begins to preach that first gospel sermon relative to Jesus. And he says that, in this is Acts 2:23, that Jesus was delivered by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God. So he is delivered by God. The Father has through his determinate counsel and foreknowledge, God knew these things ahead of time, and it was by his design that Jesus would be delivered. You also understand that it is by Jesus himself that delivering takes place. Because Jesus, you take a passage like John chapter 10 and verse number 18, he says, "No man taketh it, but I lay it down of myself," speaking of his own life, talking about himself being the good shepherd and how he would give his life for his sheep. And he says, "No man taketh it from me." That is, there isn't the ability within man to force God to do anything. In this case, Jesus. When it came to his death, it wasn't in the ability of man, like these Jewish leaders, to have killed Jesus. The statement that is made later on in the book of Matthew, he could have called 12 legions of angels, that he should not be delivered to the Jews. Jesus, of his own will, was willing to go to the cross. And so being delivered was not only by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God, it was also by his own will or his own desire to fulfill that plan of God that he would deliver himself. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 9 through 18 speaks of how he was willing to come into this world and be found in like fashion as the seed of Abraham, the descendants of Abraham. So he was willing to take on flesh and blood, to the end that he would taste death for every man. And so understanding that it was within the power of Jesus to halt that action of man just indicates that he was willing to become flesh, to be like his brethren, to the end that he could go to the cross. And so this idea of the present state, the Son of Man is delivered, yes, it was by a traitorous disciple. Yes, it was by a hypocritical Jewish leadership that Judas was able to so barter for the life of Jesus and receive those 30 pieces of silver, an amount somewhere around $15 in current value. And yet, by the Father's will and by the willingness of Jesus, he is delivered. Now, Jesus also addresses not just the present state, but the reason for this deliverance and to whom he was delivered. So notice again back to Matthew 17 and verse 22, the Son of Man shall be delivered into the hands of men. When he says delivered into the hands of men, now remember, it's the determinate counsel of God and his foreknowledge that precipitates this, that makes this possible. And it's through the means of a traitorous disciple that it actually happens. And it's with the full willingness of Jesus to allow it to himself. But he is delivered into the hands of men, meaning he puts himself in their power. He is delivered by the determinate counsel of God, the foreknowledge of God, into the hands of men for them to do whatever they will with him. So he's delivered into the hands of men. Being delivered, think about what that implies. Being delivered into their hands, meaning that they now have power to do whatever they will with Jesus, it tested their character. What kind of people were they? What would they do once Jesus was within their power? That is, they had the ability now, the leeway to do whatever they wanted to do with Jesus. What would they do? It really tests their character. And so Acts chapter 2 and verse 23 speaks of their wicked hands. They had blood on their hands. Jesus being delivered into their hands, being within their power, they chose to kill him. And that demonstrated the true character of those individuals. It also proved the voluntary nature of his obedience. He put himself within their power so that they would do whatever they would, and it proved his voluntary nature and obedience. You know, you recognize and you understand what true obedience is by the things that are suffered. That is the difficulty that comes with obedience. In Hebrews chapter 5, verse 8 and 9, he talks about though he were a son, he was the Son of God, yet he learned obedience by the things which he suffered, and being made perfect, he became the author of eternal salvation unto all them that obey him. He learned obedience by the things that he suffered. It's one thing to do what you're told to do when it is not contested, when it goes with what you desire, when it costs you nothing. Whatever description you want to use there to describe the ease with which something is accomplished when there is no adversity that comes from that, or there is no adversity with which you are faced in accomplishing it, when there is no challenge to that obedience. But then the Hebrew writer says he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. Being delivered into the hands of men, it tested the character of men, but it also demonstrated just how voluntary the obedience of Jesus was. Because he suffered. He became obedient, or he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. He understood what obedience was from the standpoint that he did it despite what happened to him. And when we get to those chapters in Matthew, chapter 27 particularly, and we begin to kind of break down and understand the vile nature of crucifixion and the heinous nature of that kind of death and the things that preceded it, led up to it in the scourging and so forth, Jesus suffered tremendously. But it was a voluntary thing because he delivered himself. He had it within his power to call 12 legions of angels so that he would not be delivered unto the Jews, that he would not be in the hands of men. But he willingly did not call those 12 legions, and he submitted himself to the will of men, and they brought great suffering upon him. It also shows how blind sin can be. Because when you think about it, they supposed a great triumph over Jesus. When Jesus was put to death, they supposed that they had really come out victorious relative to him. Once he was buried in the earth, once his body was placed within that sepulcher and the stone was rolled in front of it, they thought that was the end. They had won. And it just demonstrates how blind sin is. Because while he was delivered into the hands of men and they would do what they would with him, there was actually victory that was won by Jesus. Number one, he was victorious over sin and temptation, in that his willingness to obey was tested by the things that he suffered, and he remained true to the will of God despite the suffering that had been incurred in his life. Despite the agonizing death that he was dying, he stayed true to the will of God. In that there was victory. But then even in the resurrection there was victory. And they didn't understand, man didn't understand. Even Caiaphas, in John chapter 7, said it is expedient that one man die and not the nation. And what he was basically saying was, we're drawing the ire of Rome, and it's better for one man in Jesus to die than for Rome to come in here and destroy us all. And he really didn't know what he was saying or the veracity of his statement relative to Jesus, that one man would die for the salvation of that nation, for the salvation of all men. He didn't really fully comprehend or understand what it was, how blind sin is. 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 9 speaks of those that are blind and cannot see afar off because their faith has not been growing. Their faith has not been increasing. In that passage, he says, add to your faith virtue and knowledge and temperance and patience and godliness and brotherly kindness and charity or love. And he says, if those things be in you and abound, they make you that ye should be neither barren nor unfruitful. But he that is lacking is blind and cannot see afar off. And so this idea that Jesus was delivered, that he willingly, voluntarily submitted himself according to the will of God, the determinate counsel of God, and through means of a disciple betraying him, Jesus would fully comprehend what it was for one very close to him to be the one that would betray him, and then go through all of that suffering. It tested the character of man, it proved his voluntary nature, and it definitely demonstrated just how blind sin can be. That's why we need God's word so desperately. Because man left to himself cannot find his way along. It's not in man that walketh to direct his steps. Sin can make us very blinded to what is truth, what is reality, and what we really need. And this very idea, this concept that he was delivered into the hands of men shows that. Now, Jesus didn't stop with that. He did go on to say, and the third day he shall be raised again. Jesus explains the future state. Now, in the immediate circumstance, he would be delivered by means of a traitorous disciple. Men would have him in their power to do with what they would, and they would choose to execute him. They would choose to kill him. But with that, the power of men's hands would be taken away. He would no longer be in the hands of men. His death, that rugged cross that he was willing to go to, ended the control of men's hands. His death ended the power of men, or men's hands, in controlling him or doing with him what they would. In fact, with the resurrection, you have a great pronouncement of the hands of God now. In Romans 1:4, it says Jesus was declared to be the Son of God with power through that means of resurrection. His resurrection was in God's hands, number one, because prophecy demanded it. Psalm 16, verse 8 through 11, is quoted by Peter in Acts chapter 2, how his soul would not be left in hell, neither would his flesh see corruption. He wouldn't even be long enough in the grave for the physical body to begin the process of returning to the dust of the ground. His soul, his spiritual side, that part of man that God has given to everyone, the soul of man, would not be left in the Hadean realm, in that spiritual place of the waiting. Paradise is what Jesus called it to the thief on the cross when that man confessed Jesus, acknowledged who Jesus was, and asked for salvation under the terms of the old law. And Jesus said, "Today thou shalt be with me in paradise." In paradise, the soul of Jesus, the Spirit of Jesus, did not stay. It was not left there. But rather God raised him from the dead. His office and undertaking called for his resurrection in order for him to be this high priest who could bear our infirmities. Hebrews 4:15 and 16. He needed to go through what he did and be raised from the dead. Divine justice needed it. Death is required when sin is committed. Remember, even in the Garden of Eden, with the tree of knowledge of good and evil, God said, "In the day thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die." God gave forth a law, and the penalty for the violation of that law demanded death. The wages of sin is death, Romans 6:23. Ezekiel 18:20, the soul that sinneth, it shall die. It is the necessary consequence of sin, and divine justice demands that when sin is committed, death must come. That's divine justice. But the work of Christ and his being raised from the dead, to taste death for every man, to pay the penalty of sin, Romans chapter 3, verse 24 and 25, or 1 Corinthians chapter 1 as well. Several passages that focus on the idea that the death of Christ was propitiatory. It took our place. It became a means by which the wrath of God, the justice of God was appeased, or it was met. And so Jesus' death was demanded by divine justice, but so was his resurrection. And the defeat of Satan required it. Hebrews 2 in verse 14, in order to destroy him that had the power over death. And so Jesus explained the future. He would be raised from the dead. Now, it seems to be that that point is not settling into the ears of the apostles. Interesting that in Luke, Jesus says this, let these sayings sink down in your ears, for the Son of Man shall be delivered into the hands of men. But they understood not the saying. Let it sink down into your ears. Let it settle in. Mull this over. Let it be firmly affixed in your mind. Now, it is the case that later on in Luke 24 and verse 6, they would be reminded that Jesus had said this. When at the tomb, where's the body of Jesus? They would be told, remember Jesus told you before his death that this would happen. And so the resurrection, really the point of death, ended the power of men's hands. And then it was in God's hands, and God raised him from the dead. And prophecy demanded that resurrection. The office or the undertaking of Jesus as high priest demanded the resurrection. Divine justice demanded that resurrection. And the defeat of Satan required that resurrection. Now here's just a little point of application. Jesus was delivered into the hands of men very literally. And what they did with him in the first century was nail him to a cross. Even if they weren't the ones that literally put the nails through his hands and feet, they clamored, crucify him, crucify him. So in the hands of men, he was crucified. Today, though, Jesus is put into your hands in a figurative way through the preaching of the cross. Jesus is presented to you through his death, burial, and resurrection as your Savior. What will you do with him? In that sense, Jesus is in your hands today. It is within your power to do something with Jesus. So what will you do? We sing the old hymn, what will you do with Jesus, my friend? Neutral you cannot be. Today, you must do something with Jesus. What will you do? The second part of chapter 17 that we need to get to today, we look at verse 24 through 27, and we recognize very hurriedly that we're talking about a problem or a situation regarding taxation. In verse number 24, he says, and when they were come to Capernaum, remember they've entered into Galilee. Capernaum is one of the cities of Galilee up on the northwest bank of the Sea of Galilee. And so when they actually come into Capernaum, they that received tribute money came to Peter and said, doth not your master pay tribute? Up to this point, they had not received or they had not observed Jesus paying tribute. And of course, tribute here is another word for tax. You'll also find the word custom. Now, each of those words may have indicated something different or a slightly different taxation. But the question still remains the same. Is your master going to pay the tax? Is he going to pay the tribute money? Now, Peter says, yes, absolutely. Verse 25, he saith, yes. And when he was come into the house, Jesus prevented him, saying, or went before him and said. Before Peter could say anything about it, Jesus addressed the matter first. Now, in this particular situation, there's a couple of things that you need to recognize, you need to understand. This particular tribute has got to be recognized based on the meaning of the two words that you find here. in verse number 24, the word tribute is used. And the Greek word from which tribute is translated is a word that means didrachmon, or didrach. And what that is a silver coin that had the equivalent value of a half shekel. Keep that in mind, the half shekel. The half shekel, or the shekel, was a Jewish distribution of money, or a Jewish denomination of money. And then when you come to the latter verse, and Jesus says that in the fish's mouth there'll be a piece of money, the term piece of money there is actually the word stater, which was a coin equal to 1 whole shekel. So the tribute that they ask about is the half shekel. And then the term that Jesus uses in verse 27 means the full shekel. And there he says, you're going to give it for me and thee. So the first one was relative to the master himself, just Jesus. Is Jesus going to pay a half shekel tax? And then when Jesus addresses it and says, yes, Peter, go pay it for me and you, he says the coin will be sufficient because it's a full shekel, a half shekel each. Well, if we go back to Exodus chapter 20, in Exodus chapter 20, or rather chapter 30, Exodus chapter 30, verse 11 through 16, you'll notice that this was a temple tax placed upon the male children of Abraham, aged 20 years of age and older. And so for every male 20 years old and older, there was a tribute that was paid to the temple, or for the temple, of 1/2 shekel. And so when you notice the piece of money was sufficient for 2 men, that would equal 1 whole shekel. And so the tax that we're talking about here is the temple tax, a tax that was peculiar to the Jewish people or to the Israelite people, and it related to the temple. And so it was a tribute for the temple and for the temple's God. We've got to keep that in mind as we look to what Jesus says, because later on Jesus will say, when answering the question about taxation by Caesar, the Roman emperor, he'll say, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. And he was not Caesar's son. But here he talks about being a son. So understand, first of all, we're talking about the temple tax, which is going to make his argument especially sensible for Peter's sake. So, what are we talking about here? First of all, let me mention to you that what happens here is a miracle that only is one of only 2 or 3 that Matthew records. Only Matthew will tell us about this particular miracle regarding the coin in the fish's mouth. One of the other miracles that only Matthew tells us about was in chapter 9, verse 27 through 31, dealing with the 2 blind men receiving sight. Matthew also is the only one that tells us about Peter walking on the water. Now, in that instance in Matthew 14, Jesus walking on the water is actually relayed to us in Luke's account too, and maybe John. But only Matthew records the part about Peter getting out of the boat. And then in Matthew 21:14, he tells us about some healing that Jesus did in a generic way, that he healed the blind and the lame at the temple after his triumphal entry in Matthew 21. So this particular miracle had something to do with Matthew's overall purpose of presenting Jesus as a king. So what was that? Well, let's go back to this idea that it was a temple tax. How does that fit in or fit Matthew's program of presenting Jesus as the Messiah? Well, he says, what thinkest thou, Simon, of whom do the kings of the earth take custom or tribute? Of their own children or of strangers? And the obvious answer is of strangers. The king's children don't pay the tax. Rather, they are recipients of the tax. They are the ones who make benefit of that tax money. In this case, Jesus is saying to Peter, do you think I'm subject to pay that tax? I am the Son of God. Remember, the temple was God's habitation, God's house. And so the tribute money went to God. And of whom do kings take tribute? Their own children? Indicating that Jesus is the Son of God, and he is not subject to the taxation of the half shekel for the temple. He wasn't one who was amenable to that taxation law. And yet, at the end of the chapter, he still pays it so as not to offend. And so the greater point is, as he was not a subject of that taxation, he is actually presenting himself as the Son of God. This is an argument to him being the Messiah. That's why Matthew includes it in his book and no other does, because it fits the purpose that Matthew is speaking of. Jesus is the Messiah. Argumentation, he is the Son of God. Now, a couple of things to point out by way of application. Number one, you have to know what Jesus is presenting about taxation and paying taxes. In Matthew 22:21, he'll say, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. Jesus actually taught that it was legitimate to pay taxes. Now, when it comes to that taxation, maybe we could talk about the fairness and all of that in another setting. But as it pertains to paying taxes, we recognize that obviously the Bible presents the idea that God does not forbid governments to levy taxes. His kings did it in Israel and Judah. Romans chapter 13 says that we are to be subject to the powers that be because they are ordained of God. And Jesus told us, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. And Paul in Romans chapter 13, render tribute to whom tribute is due, honor to whom honor, custom to whom custom. And those were words that regarded taxation. If this had been a matter of Roman taxation, then Jesus would have been subject to pay that tax. That's why we point out that it was a temple tax. But Jesus is also presenting the idea that we need to obey them that have the rule over us in the civil government aspect. Now, keep in mind that the laws of a particular nation may allow certain activities among their citizens, like the right even to protest. And without violating the law, and yet still being in subject to the powers that be, even protest may be lawful and approved of God in that, in that way. The second thing that we might want to point out is that at the end of this, Jesus does say, notwithstanding, lest we should offend them. And he tells Peter, go get the coin out of the fish's mouth and pay the tax for me and you, lest it create an offense. Jesus was not subject to it, so he was not bound by the law, being the Son of God, to pay the half shekel tax. But lest it become an offense to other people. Now, why would Peter be so interested in paying it? Could it be that it was based on the previous action of Jesus? Could it be that Jesus had been seen paying this tax before? Perhaps. Maybe Jesus had paid it before. He had been in and around Capernaum for almost 3 years. And so it would have come to the point of paying this tax on at least 2 other occasions in the earthly ministry of Jesus, while Peter would have been a disciple following him. And this would have been the 3rd occasion. And so maybe based on past action, Peter assumed that Jesus would be paying it. Or it could be that based on the previous subject matter that Jesus had been addressing, that Peter spoke in such an impetuous way. Remember, Peter often spoke impetuously, or in a way in which he would speak before he thought. Jesus had been talking about how he would be delivered and they would kill him. Well, one sure way to raise the ire of the people would to be seen not paying the tax, not observing the temple tax. And so maybe that's why Peter answered that way. But Peter was way too quick to answer without considering exactly who Jesus was. Remember, it was Peter who said, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." And if Peter recognized that, understood that, and had faith in that, then Peter could have recognized even himself that Jesus was not subject to that tax. But that being the case, Jesus still said, "Pay it so we don't offend." Lest we offend. You know, there are other passages of Scripture regarding our behavior and how our behavior corresponds to others. And there are matters about which it may be expediency or it may be freedom, wherein we can do certain things. But we are also told to consider other individuals. In 1 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse number 9, the Apostle Paul speaks to the idea that we are not islands to ourselves. We are not individuals who are so removed from our surrounding and from our society that we can live however we want. He says this, "Take heed lest by any means this liberty of yours become a stumbling block to them that are weak." So 1 Corinthians chapter 8 regards this matter of expediency. He's talking about eating meats offered to idols, how an idol was nothing, and how really it wasn't a big deal, but not everyone had that same knowledge. And so he's telling them, while you may have this knowledge that there's absolutely nothing wrong with eating meats offered to idols, knowledge of the truth, of the veracity of that, but your brother doesn't, don't do something that is going to cause him to stumble. Rather, refrain from the meat for a time or for that period so that you don't cause them to fall away or to violate their own conscience in partaking too. Romans chapter 14 and 15 have a similar discussion in which, if you'll notice in Romans chapter 14, he says in verse number 7, "For none of us liveth to himself, and no man dieth to himself." We're living under the Lord, so we always have to live with respect to our relationship with the Lord, but we also have to live with respect to the relationship we have with our fellow man. So in verse 13, he says, "Let us not therefore judge one another anymore, but judge this rather, that no man put a stumbling block or an occasion to fall in his brother's way." Let's focus on that. Let's focus on not causing our brother to stumble. Don't let our liberty cause us to be a stumbling block to somebody else. Just because we can do something doesn't mean we should do something. Just because Jesus didn't have to pay the tax didn't mean it was expedient or the best thing to do not to pay the tax. If it offended them or would offend them, Jesus said, "I'd rather be out the half shekel and your half shekel, Peter, than to cause offense." Verse number 15 of Romans 14 said, "But if thy brother be grieved with thy meat, now walkest thou not charitably, destroy him not with thy meat, for whom Christ died." Be charitable with your behavior. Be considerate of your fellow man. And then in chapter 15, "We that are strong ought to bear the infirmities of the weak, and not to please ourselves. Let every one of us please his neighbor for his good to edification." We want our activities to be edifying or edificacious. I don't even know if that's a word. I don't know why it come out that way. We want our actions to edify others. We want them to be effectual to the building up of other individuals. And so Jesus says, "Lest we offend." We ought to give consideration to our behavior just like Jesus gave consideration to his behavior, even though what he was doing in not yet paying that temple tax was all right. Jesus said, "Let's pay it, lest we offend." Let us always be considerate of other individuals. Now, we can't do wrong and say, well, we just didn't want to offend someone. And we can't refrain to do right and say, well, we just didn't want to offend someone. But in matters of expediency, in matters of liberty, sometimes it may be that we need to forego our liberty in order not to offend someone else. By liberty, we mean that matter of expediency. Just because it's right to do doesn't always mean it, or that it's permissible to do. Let's put it that way. Just because it's permissible to do doesn't always mean it's the best thing to do at the time. And so Jesus said, lest we offend, let's go ahead and pay that tax, even though he was not subject to it, as was Peter. So we finish out Matthew 17. Two incidents that demonstrate Jesus to be the Messiah. His death, burial, and resurrection foretold. As a matter of prophecy, they should have known that's what was going to happen. They should have been able to connect those dots, but they weren't able to at that point. With the resurrection of Jesus, they would be reminded of that in Luke 24, and then they would begin preaching that in Acts chapter 2. The death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, demonstrating that he was the Son of God with power, Romans 1:4. And then the matter that he was not subject to the temple tax because he was the Son of God also demonstrates he was the Messiah. The great question at the end of the lesson is simply this: will you humble yourself to obey the King of Kings, the Son of God? May God bless you till we study again.